So being at Micron back in the earlier days definitely was not the most inclusive company that we are today.
I really wanted to be normal like everybody else. I didn't want to be stigmatized as somebody different.
And at that time, my English was very bad, so I felt really outside because I didn't understand what the people were saying.
Well, coming in from India to the US as a foreign student was certainly quite challenging for the first few months for me. Those days, early days, were hard because I was totally an outsider.
I went to the bathroom one day, and coming out of the bathroom, this person stopped and was telling me about something needed to be cleaned up. I guess he assumed that I was a janitor. And I know there are a lot of people of color that works in the janitorial department, and I felt in a way that I was stereotyped in that way. It's like, I was a janitor and nothing else.
I was once told I was using the wrong restroom because as someone who was gay, I shouldn't be using the men's room.
I remember one time I mentioned to a coworker that, hey, I am deaf. I can't hear very well. Can you speak up? And she was like, what? You're deaf? You don't look deaf. And I'm like, what are they supposed to look like? Point them out to me.
She made a comment that why would you even bother studying so much when all you have to do is come back home and cook and take care of your kids and your husband.
To me, inclusion means that every team member feels respected and that their voice matters.
Everyone is important. Everyone is valued.
Is when people are free to be able to express themselves.
You have to be able to listen to all the various points of views, and that leads again to new ideas.
You see diversity every single day when you walk through those doors. That's important to me. I come from a different background, but I don't think of myself as different when I walk in.
And if we all feel included and belong in a company, a company can go to the next level.
We need to work together, listen to each other.
Once we listen to each other's story and find out where those stories come from, we have better chance to understand and work with each other.
And together, we can co-create something beautiful.
The good thing is that I work at Micron now. Who didn't care how I look? They don't care how I talk. All they care is what I have to offer.
I now feel comfortable bringing my authentic self to work. And I found that when I brought all of myself to work and not just a piece of myself or what I thought people wanted to see, that is when my career really took off.
Instead of staying with the stereotype, we should challenge ourselves and ask ourselves, why do we think the way we do? And then talk to each other. Talking to each other helps us understand the differences, not see them as higher or lower value, but see them as differences that we can work with.
We want to make sure that all different backgrounds, all different voices are really equal in terms of their representation here at Micron.
Together, we can build a stronger, more inclusive company.
Well, thank you, everyone. That was our diversity, equality, and inclusion video. Will be available externally on December 4th, along with our diversity, equality, and inclusion 2019 report. For those of you all who don't know me, again, I'm the Vice President of Diversity, Equality, and Inclusion at Micron, and I'm also a visiting professor at San Jose State University. So I thought I would go ahead and just jump right into the presentation and start by telling you all a little bit about my background and my perspective. So that's me 20 years ago. I know you all can't believe it. I can't believe it either. But I started my career actually teaching, and this is a photo of me teaching at the Henry Robinson, thank you, the Henry Robinson Multi-Service Center in West Oakland, which is actually a homeless shelter for parents and their children. And so there are a lot of similarities between me and the students that you see in this picture, but there are also some things that are unique that I want to talk about. So similar to me, these students grew up in what is considered the flatlands of Oakland. So Oakland is divided by a freeway by 580, or another reference point is MacArthur Boulevard. And then you also have above MacArthur the Oakland Hills. And so what was interesting is that many of these students are from single parents homes, such as I am. But what was unique for my situation is that my father was college educated and he was a strong advocate of education. And so he was able to find an opportunity for me to attend a public school above 580 so that I could have the best Oakland public education available to me. And I really think that that was instrumental in me being able to, for one, be here today, because I received a quality education. I had teachers who invested in me. I had resources available to me that many of these students unfortunately didn't have. And so that's one of the reasons that I'm so passionate about diversity and inclusion. It's really about making sure that everyone has access to education, to information. As Jeff shared, talented people should have an opportunity to land the career that they're interested in. So why does DEI matter to Micron? So I'm sure you all have seen the data. For example, the Harvard Business Review points out that companies that have higher diversity actually have higher OP, 12% versus 8% on average. Gartner did a survey last year, and they shared that companies that are diverse and inclusive actually have 20% higher employee engagement. So the statistics are there. One business case that I love is actually for Frito-Lay. So they had an employee resource group that was really geared towards their Hispanic and Latino population. And this group decided that they were going to pitch a new Dorito. And who doesn't love Doritos? I do. So they came up with an idea for a guacamole flavored Dorito chip. And they pitched this to their executives and to the sales team, and they weren't quite sure, but they worked very closely with the R&D team and told them they needed to add more lime to the flavoring. And the end result was that chip, Doritos guacamole chip, was one of the best-selling chips, and in year one, it grossed $100 million in sales. And so that is the power of diversity and inclusion. It's really making sure that the people we work with, the employees that we have, are representative of the customers that we want to serve and the communities that we serve, and that they also have a voice so that they're able to share and accelerate our business growth. So we're at Techonomy. Let's talk a little bit about tech. Does tech include or does tech exclude when it comes to diversity and inclusion? So we saw a fabulous presentation from Dr. Colin Paris, and he shared a little bit about the advancements in AI and humble AI, which is different than arrogant AI, apparently. But through that conversation, we can see that we've made some huge advancements, but there's still an area for opportunity. So I'm sure all of us are familiar with the challenges with facial recognition. So a few years ago, there was a study that showed that facial recognition can actually identify a white male's face 99% of the time. But for women of color, that statistic was actually 35%. And that's because that population was left out of the test cases, right? So huge opportunity there. If you're keeping up with the news, apparently, even if you have a higher credit score than your husband, he may get 20 times more credit with the Apple Pay card to purchase things, right? So again, we can see how bias is built into our systems and our technology. So a huge opportunity there. And just earlier, Bari and I were having lunch, and we were talking about how this type of discrimination and bias is very unethical and almost criminal. So we, in particular, I was thinking of Oakland, California, where a software was piloted to identify areas that were predicted to have high crime and high drug sales. But unfortunately, what that algorithm was doing was it was highlighting areas that had a high population of minorities regardless of the crime rate. So those are just some examples. of how we need to ensure that as we're designing software and we're utilizing AI and machine learning, that we are being inclusive and we're thinking about everyone as we're building, creating, innovating. Micron in particular is extremely dedicated to this. So we launched a $1 million grant in 2018 called Advancing Curiosity, the Advancing Curiosity Fund. And what that's really aimed to do is to provide funding to UCLA, for example. So they are working at really trying to eliminate bias in AI. We also, the Rochester Technology Institute also tapped into some of those funds to design AI solutions for people that are hard of hearing. So again, I really challenge all of you all as we're designing to think about tech including everyone and not just a portion of the community. So, how do we need to reset our thinking? One way we can do this is really thinking about the definition of diversity. I talked to a lot of different people about this topic, and one thing that I've noticed is we tend to think in one dimension. We see diversity as gender, and we need to create more representation, or we see it as a problem that impacts Hispanics or Blacks. But the reality is we all have a unique perspective. We all have some sort of diversity that we're bringing into this room today. So how do we tap into that? How do we appreciate that? How do we ensure that everyone in this room has equal speaking power so that the best ideas rise to the top? That really is our mission of diversity, equality, and inclusion at Micron. So thank you.
So you just spoke about different realms of diversity, and so I'm just going to jump right in. How do you feel about cognitive diversity versus representational diversity and what that means in tech?
Yeah, that is a great question. So one of the first things that I noticed stepping into Micron is we're an engineering population, so we are so focused on numbers and data and representation, and I really think that you need both, right? So even when you think about diversity and inclusion, it's almost thrown together, right? We're moving so fast, but they're two very different things. So I think about diversity as what we have in the organization. That's really our representation, our mix of people. And what I would like to see is that what we have matches the talent addressable market. Meaning if we see, 7% of people with disabilities as the US population, that should be mirrored in the workplace as well. But then there's also diversity of thought as well, which is also important. And that's more around creating an inclusive environment where all of those ideas can be put on the table and everyone feels comfortable sharing their perspective, right? And they're not holding back. So they're bringing their full self to work and they're sharing those ideas, and others are open to listening to those ideas. I think that's the key.
So how do you feel about, do you like the word diversity? I'm going to say full stop, I don't love it. And the reason being is that when you say it, there are certain people whose eyes just completely glaze over because they feel like it doesn't apply to them. And so I tend to prefer the word inclusion because everyone has a story about being excluded from something. So if you had to pick one, which one would you pick?
So I do like diversity. I think that they're both important. I think that people define diversity as one dimension, and that's where people get away from seeing themselves in the D. That being said, I've seen companies really struggle on their talent acquisition processes and to really recruit that talent and bring them in, but then the talent doesn't stay, right? So you're seeing constant turnover. You're really wasting the fruits of your effort because you don't have that inclusive environment. So if I had to pick one, I would say if you're going to spend your time somewhere, I would say spend your time on inclusion, because if you're creating an environment environment where people want to come on Monday morning and they feel that they're valued and they're respected and that their point of view is heard and amplified, that's going to naturally attract the diversity that you want. That word is going to get around, and you're not going to have to spend all your time in talent acquisition because people are going to want to come work there.
Mm-hmm. So we talked before about how diversity is a four-legged stool. So you should be thinking about your employee base, your customers, your board members, and your suppliers, and people tend to not focus as much on the last two in terms of their vendors and suppliers and board members. So how would you coach people or advise them to make sure that they're attacking it and thinking about it holistically from these four different angles?
Thank you for that question. So every company's diversity, equality, and inclusion strategy is going to be different. Ours is 4 pillars, so it's focused on, one, creating equality for all, so making sure that we are paying fairly, making sure that we are promoting fairly, that our hiring practices are inclusive. We're also focused on driving diversity, which is more of the representation piece, and the third pillar of our strategy is around inclusion. So making sure, again, when people get here that they feel welcomed. And then the last pillar of our strategy is really around thought leadership. And that's why I'm here today. It's really about sharing what we're doing, what's working, what's not working, so that we all can benefit from this as a community and help to make progress. So I would say for us, when we looked at our strategies, suppliers are such a large component of the work that we do. It would be negligent of us not to think about supplier diversity. So I'm super excited. This is the first year we're highlighting our supplier diversity program in our DEI report. And I've been actively partnering with with the procurement team to really think about how do we support our diverse suppliers? How do we ensure that they understand the requirements so that when they can continue to remain suppliers, so for Micron, for example, we have a lot of protocol around security, as you can imagine. So making sure that our vendors are ready for any new requirements that we're rolling out. It's a lot easier for a larger supplier to be ready opposed to a smaller supplier. So I think that has to be a part of your strategy. It's not just representation of employees and employee engagement. If you have suppliers, it's also thinking about making sure that you have equitable opportunities when we talk about equality for all suppliers. So that's one piece.
What would that look like to you?
Yeah, so to me, that looks like a competitive bidding process. So making sure that, let me back up, looking at the suppliers that are available. So really understanding, what type of goals should we have around diverse suppliers, what's truly available, and then making sure that we have a competitive bidding process where they are able to be a part of that process. And two, understanding that because they may be a smaller supplier, they may need a little extra holding along the way.
So when you're thinking about employee representation, and if you double click on that and you think about, okay, we have a certain percentage of employee representation, but if you kind of peel the layers of that onion back and you see, okay, well, 60% of these folks are entry level, or they're contractors, or if they're not contractors, sometimes you're not even counting them. But what are some other things that people should be double clicking on and looking into, not just from a superficial or a high level, but what should they really kind of dig into and look into?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's so many areas that you can focus on. So I think one is acknowledging exactly what you said. So understanding not just your overall baseline of where you are from a representation standpoint, but looking at the various levels in your organization and understanding where you have opportunity, whether that's in your technical roles or your leadership roles. And then you want to look at where is that talent coming from. So if you're mostly bringing in senior candidates through referrals, maybe there's an opportunity to tap into other diverse agencies for those referrals. So I think having the partnership with talent acquisition for me is key. But the other thing is also acknowledging that there is a pipeline problem. So when I showed that picture earlier of the students in Oakland, the reality is when we look at our technical representation, for example, of blacks in engineering roles, there is not a wide pool to pull from.
See, I would push back on you for that.
Uh-huh.
And the only reason being is you have, Alabama A&T. You have North Carolina A&T. These schools are graduating thousands of black engineers a year, but people keep going to Harvard, Stanford, MIT, certain schools to select. And so you're already going to have a deficit when you're looking for certain types of diverse candidates because those students are not going to those schools. So is it about that there's a pipeline problem, or is it about you need to get out of your comfort zone and look someplace that you wouldn't normally look? My grandmother used to say, to get something you haven't got, you have to do something you haven't done.
Yeah, so I would encourage a two-prong approach, and so that's what we do at Micron. So one is we certainly recruit from all the schools you would think, MIT, UC Berkeley, and of course there is a smaller pool there. So we are really partnering with the diverse groups on campus, such as NSBE, the National Association of Black Engineers, to pull in that talent from those schools. But then the second piece of it is the partnership with the historically black colleges and universities. So I would say you need to go after both. But that being said, there is a smaller pool, and and there is no mistaking that we need to encourage more of our underrepresented groups to go into STEM. So I think that there's a huge opportunity. So I would argue that companies even need to go a step further and look at, for example, with Micron, we have a foundation. So we're really trying to expose the younger generation to opportunities in STEM and to the world of semiconductor and engineering at a much earlier age so that that talent is accessible, and we're continuing to increase that pipeline.
What are your thoughts on candidates from coding schools? So let's say that they don't go to college at all. There are some companies that don't necessarily prefer that. But what is your personal view on it?
So I say, again, that really to me is diversity of thought and bringing people in from different backgrounds. So there's certainly jobs that we would consider that require a 4-year degree, but there are many jobs that don't. And so I would say we would welcome that type of talent in our organization. And I think there's also an opportunity to bring in students like that and then put them through a 4-year program in addition to the coding skills that they have. So I think that that is a phenomenal way to bring diverse talent into the organization.
And how would you advise people to look at metrics for success in terms of what is or isn't working? So, and a perfect example is I see a lot of companies donate money to girls who code, black girls code, pick your favorite who code.
Yes.
And it's fine to do that, and it's very philanthropic, but if you are not tracking that cohort that you funded, and also if you don't have any placement or internships for them when it's over, how do you know how successful that donation was? So what do metrics for success, what would you advise people to look at in terms of successful metrics for any diversity program they have?
Yeah, so again, I've been having a lot of conversations about metrics. We love data at Micron. So best practice, what I've been reading and talking to my peers about is really you're looking for year-over-year improvement. So did you do better this year than you did last year as far as representation? Again, I think a lot of times people get stuck looking at just the representation of their organization, but they're not looking at the engagement of those groups. So I think engagement surveys are a great way to look at how inclusive your environment is. I think another great measure is to look at promotion rates. So who are you promoting? When are you promoting them?
How long does it take?
How long does it take, right? People don't like to wait more than a couple of years now. What criteria are you using? So I think good checks and balance all the way around. But I would say overall, when you're looking at the diversity inclusion initiative, you should be looking for year-over-year improvement. You should be looking at, are you creating an inclusive environment? So again, that can be your engagement survey. And you should be providing some type of, I would say, education to your employees. So one thing that we measure is we have an inclusive leader training, and we measure who goes through that training, right? And then once they've gone through, do their engagement scores improve? So I think there's a lot of opportunity to look at measurements not just around representation, but what does the environment look like, and what do your overall practices in your organization look like?
Awesome. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you all.